David Bowie is easily one of the greatest artists to ever come out of the UK, and his Berlin trilogy has proven to be the highest point of his artistic career. But during his Berlin adventures, Bowie chose to bring along one of his closest friends and the godfather of punk himself, Iggy Pop. While the two were staying together, Bowie decided to collaborate with Iggy on his first two solo albums. These albums ended up being counted later as a crucial part of Bowie's Berlin trilogy, and at the same time, they influenced almost every goth and post-punk band to come out of the 80s. So let's dive deeper into these first two Iggy Pop records and see what was actually happening behind the curtains. Make sure to subscribe if you have a lust for life, and enjoy! This is the story of David Bowie and Iggy Pop. I think most of you guys probably know more about David Bowie than Iggy Pop, so I'm gonna start off this video with a little backstory behind one of punk's greatest figures. James Newell Osberg Jr., or Iggy Pop, was born in 1947 in a trailer park in Michigan. In 1967, he went and saw the Doors live, and after a terribly amazing performance by Jim Morrison, where he got drunk and started just screaming and throwing stuff at the audience, Iggy got filled with inspiration and decided to form his own band the very next year. This band was The Stooges. 50 years later and a bunch of rock and roll awards, I still think that The Stooges never got the praise they deserved for being so ahead of their time with their punk sound. If you don't know anything about them, The Stooges were one of the main proto-punk bands, and just like the Velvet Underground, they were one of those bands who never got the fame they deserved when they were active. What happened was that they pioneered the punk sound, and then 15-20 years later, people went back and realized, oh, these guys were ahead of everyone else and really influenced the underground scene. They probably deserve more credit. The Stooges' discography is a topic for another video, but except their music, Iggy basically invented the punk attitude. His performances will leave fans shocked every single time, with half the audience being scared for their life, and the other half absolutely loving it. He was one of the first people to ever do a stage dive, and he's the guy who made it famous. He used to cover himself in blood, roll around in broken glass, show his dick on stage, shout at the people in the audience, throw stuff at them, call them slurs, stab himself with a knife on stage. There were even rumors in '73 that he was planning to himself live on stage. If you couldn't predict by his attitude, Iggy and the Stooges normally started to fall in love with a lot of different substances. This, combined with their lack of commercial success, made for tensions to rise in the group. By 1971, the band didn't have a record deal, and they started performing in a bunch of small clubs just so they could make enough money to pass by. Luckily for them, that year, Iggy Pop happened to meet David Bowie in a nightclub in New York. Bowie, with an already rising career, knew of the Stooges very well and decided to help them with their third studio album, Raw Power.
I am the world's forgotten boy, the one who searches and destroys.
Despite Raw Power being very important to punk history and it also being my favorite Stooges album, this was not enough to keep the band together. By '74, Iggy was already hooked to both white and brown sugar, and he was just getting into constant fights with his bandmates. At this time, he also became enemies with a group of bikers from Detroit called the Scorpions. The Scorpions watched Iggy perform at the Rock and Roll Farm in Michigan, which was their bar, and it's safe to say that they were not impressed. They started throwing eggs at Iggy while he was singing, and then they went and straight up punched him. After this, Iggy called them out live on the radio and told them to attend the Stooges' upcoming show at Detroit, Michigan's Palace. This show was gonna be the last show the band did together before breaking up, and it became really fucking hectic. You can listen to all this chaos in their 1976 live album, Metallic KO.
Thank you very much to the person who threw this glass bottle at my head. It nearly killed me, but you missed again, so you have to keep trying next week.
Anyways, this whole thing meant that this was the end of the Stooges, and Iggy's career was now in shambles. This caused him to get even more addicted to drugs, to the point where he checked himself into a mental institution to try and clean up. While he was there, Bowie came to visit him regularly, and one time he even tried to bring him a bag of white sugar. The hospital did decline his gift though, for some weird reason. While Iggy was going through all of this, Bowie could not have been better, career-wise at least. In 1972, he released the biggest album of his career, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Ziggy Stardust being very clearly inspired by Iggy Pop himself, down to the name of the character. 1 year later, he released another iconic album and the most famous character of his career, Aladdin Sane. I know Ziggy Stardust is his most famous character, but Aladdin Sane became the Bowie image. A lot of people just mix up the two of them and call Aladdin Sane Ziggy Stardust. It doesn't matter that much. The thing that matters is that Bowie's sudden explosion into popularity meant that Iggy had a way to get his career back. Now let's talk a bit about David Bowie's pre-Berlin era. Despite his career doing seemingly well, Bowie was probably on the lowest point of his life. In 1974, he moved to New York, where he met Iggy, and then moved to Los Angeles. The reason for this was because he was trying to understand his American audience better. That's why he became such good friends with Iggy and got a lot of inspiration from him. But moving here also caused him to get seriously addicted to white sugar. This addiction is what inspired his darkest character yet, the Thin White Duke. By 1975, Bowie had put on this cult character that was strangely really inspired by f***ism. He went on interviews talking about how the Austrian painter was the first ever rock star and how Britain needed a f***ist leader. Looking back at it now, he was either trying too hard to be edgy and controversial, or he was probably geeked out of his mind on white powder. This addiction and the loneliness he was feeling at the time all got channeled into one of my favorite Bowie albums ever, Station to Station. During the touring of his album, Bowie brought along with him his new friend who just got out of a mental institution, Iggy Pop. For the first time in his life, Iggy saw what it meant to be a famous rock star, or at least what it meant to be at Bowie's level of fame. During the last few years, his career was stunted by his addiction, and now he was ready to start all over again. With a Bowie who desperately needed to get clean, and an Iggy who just escaped from a mental institution because of his drug problems, they decided to move together into the one city that was known for not having drugs: Berlin. But before moving to Berlin and starting work on his trilogy, Bowie had booked a studio in France for a couple of weeks to help Iggy produce his first album. This is considered by a lot of people as the unofficial start of Bowie's Berlin trilogy. Despite releasing 1 year later because Bowie wanted to release his album first, so people didn't think he was copying Iggy Pop, by August 76, The Idiot was finally completed. Despite being an Iggy Pop album, The Idiot was a stepping point for both Iggy's and Bowie's music career. For Iggy, this was the exact thing he needed. He managed to evolve his music from the proto-punk days, and he was experimenting with all sorts of sounds he had never messed with before. Also, because he was touring with one of the biggest artists of the decade, commerciality and financial gain was finally something he didn't need to worry about. All he needed to do was make a good album, and Bowie would help out with everything else. On the other hand, Bowie didn't just help out financially or was a good friend for him when he needed one. Bowie wrote most of the music on this album. The only thing that was left for Iggy to do were lyrics and vocals, which I think Iggy's vocals at this point were definitely inspired by Bowie. But why did he decide to do this? Is there a reason why he just wrote a whole album for Iggy Pop, or was he just a really generous guy? Yeah, he was a nice guy, but the reason why he did all of this was the pressure he had for his upcoming albums. Just like Iggy, he wanted to clear his head from the drugs and start experimenting more with his music. The problem was that Iggy was playing small clubs in New York, barely scraping by, while Bowie had the whole world looking at him. So Iggy Pop was the perfect cover for him. He could produce his whole album and try what he wanted to try, and there wouldn't be any pressure. Iggy, seeing how he desperately needed his career back and he had no reason to say no to Bowie because he was making a bunch of amazing songs, just let him do whatever he wanted to do with the album. Now that both of them removed this immense pressure from their shoulders, how did this album actually come out? Well, believe it or not, it was amazing. Iggy fans at the time were divided into two groups. They either hated it and thought that David Bowie was pulling all the strings and they'd lost the Stooges sound they fell in love with, or, as the most common opinion, they loved it and thought that this was Iggy's best work to date. This latter statement still gets thrown around to this day, with a lot of Iggy and Bowie fans thinking that this is clearly the peak of Iggy Pop's career. But just like with his work on the Stooges, Iggy proved once again that he was ahead of the curve. The Idiot was dark, electronic, and synth. At first you might think this is about to be a pop album, but by the end of it, you realize that you could not have been more in the wrong. Iggy's lyrics are surprisingly impressive for a guy who used to stab himself on stage, but that was already a thing since the Stooges days. The difference was that this time he was talking about the darkest parts of his life. He was talking about death, the depression he felt during the nights out in the 70s, and he was reminiscing his old days with the Stooges. All of this, combined with a creatively gloomy sound by Bowie, made for some really amazing tracks. Also, yeah, for all the nerds out there, the title was taken from Dostoevsky. The album has some amazing tracks like Sister Midnight, China Girl, which later became another famous Bowie song, Fun Time, and Dum Dum Boys. There's a song that talks about the Stooges. But my favorite song on this album is none other than Nightclubbing. This is the second time I talk about this song because Nightclubbing was also featured in Trainspotting. It talks about the darker part of the 70s nightlife and how their life was becoming dull and unemotional. Its lyrics combined with a dark and hypnotic beat by Bowie and a zombie-esque way of singing by Iggy made for one of the best and most famous songs of Iggy's career. I do recommend going and listening to this whole album because it's amazing. Like I said, The Idiot proved to be very ahead of its time and ended up influencing the 80s synth and goth scene and the 90s grunge era. This was also the last album Ian Curtis from Joy Division listened to before he ended everything. By 1977, both Low and The Idiot were out, and Bowie wanted to make sure that he wasn't just using Iggy as a way to experiment with music without any consequences. He even went against his label and decided to not tour alone with his Low album, but instead he toured with Iggy promoting The Idiot. Even when they did perform, Bowie would try and not steal the attention from the crowd by staying in the back and playing the keyboard. Still, the general perception was that this was pretty much Bowie's album, and even when they did interviews together, most of the questions were about Bowie. In '89, when asked about The Idiot, Bowie said, "Poor Iggy, in a way, became a guinea pig for what I wanted to do with the sound. I didn't have the material at the time, and I didn't feel like writing at all. I felt much more like laying back and getting behind someone else's work, so that album was opportune, creatively." So naturally, Iggy became really frustrated from all of this. Even though he had finally gotten back his career, people seemed to think that he was just a doll that Bowie had control of. So he made sure that the second album was a lot more Iggy Pop than David Bowie. And I think that was a great decision because the next album he made isn't just my favorite Iggy Pop album ever, but also one of my favorite albums of all time. I'm of course talking about Lust for Life. I know there's a lot of people out there who think The Idiot is Iggy's best album, but I don't care. I love Lust for Life so much. While The Idiot is very experimental and is regarded as one of the first ever post-punk albums, Lust for Life backtracks from all of that. Instead, Iggy has a more energetic voice and the songs are more poppy and in a way inspirational. It doesn't sound like The Idiot, but it doesn't sound like the proto-punk sound of the Stooges either. It's just a perfect combination of Bowie's influence and Iggy's wilderness. The album opens up with a very well-known Trainspotting song, Lust for Life. Lust for Life talks about Iggy's life before his solo career. It talks about his battle with H addiction and his new lust for life. In fact, this whole album is inspired by Iggy's experiences. Even though the pair was trying to get clean at the time, the main character of this album was an H addict. The song was written by Bowie on a ukulele after he heard the opening to the American Forces Network news. Once a week, the Armed Forces Network would play Starsky and Hutch, and that was our little ritual. AFN would broadcast an ID when they came on the air, a representation of a radio tower, and it made a signal sound like beep 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 beep, and we went aha, we'll take that. David grabbed his ukulele, worked out the chords, and away we went. The lyrics were heavily inspired by a 1962 novel called The Ticket That Exploded, and the song reached its peak position on the charts after it got used in Trainspotting. But despite Trainspotting's explosion in popularity, Lust for Life is not Iggy's most iconic song. The title goes to The Passenger.
I am the passenger, and I ride.
The Passenger was written by one of Bowie's friends and guitarist, Ricky Gardiner. It got covered by Susie and the Banshees in '87, which if you haven't heard that cover, it's absolutely amazing. But what truly brought this track its initial fame was a Toyota advert from '98, which got the song charting at number 22. The lyrics were once again very well thought out, with Iggy being inspired by Jim Morrison poem. He wrote these lyrics on a metro in Berlin, and he talks about being the passenger in your life and never really having control of anything that happens. The only single that came out of this album was Success, but The Passenger was the B-side to that single. The last song I want to talk about before I wrap this video up is Tonight.
Everything will be alright tonight.
Tonight might be one of the most beautifully tragic love songs ever. The song opens up immediately with Bowie's vocals, and then Iggy starts talking about finding his girlfriend dying on the ground. She has overdosed on AIDS, and this song is the words he says to her when he picks her up. He repeatedly tells her that everything is gonna be alright. He will love her till the end, even though her end is here. After that, he finishes up the song by saying, "I will love her till I die. I will see her in the sky tonight." Amazing song. I don't know how it only has like 5 million plays on Spotify, but I love it so much. By the way, I just found out that David Bowie performed this song with Tina Turner, so I guess the song isn't that underground, but why does this cover suck so much? No shade to Tina Turner, but they just removed all emotion from the song. I don't know how they did that. What the fuck? Listen to the original, it's so much better. This album also didn't do that bad on the charts, but Iggy reached the peak of his fame around the 90s, when people went back and realized how truly influential he was. During his years with the Stooges and before meeting Bowie, he was genuinely barely scraping by, which I think that's the most punk thing you can do. I say that because I'm also doing the same thing.
But that's another thing, that people looking at your name and what you did would assume that the money was pouring in, but in fact you were properly old-fashioned broke for long stretches.
Hell yeah, old-fashioned broke, right on, sure was. Forever and ever and ever, until my middle age, and I've had a wonderful middle age.
40-something years later, the man is still touring, and for anyone who's wondering, yes, he still does perform without a shirt on. Isn't that something to look at? Let me know what you guys think of these two albums. I hope you enjoyed this video. I was trying to portray both Iggy and Bowie as fairly as I could, so I hope I did a good job. Check out the Discord and Patreon and give me some band recommendations in the comments. Goodbye!